So let me start off by giving you an overview of what I'm going to speak about. First, I'm going to briefly explain what is sovereign debt. After that, I'm going to try to give a very brief Marxist perspective of what debt means and what sovereign debt means in a capitalist system. And then, of course, we have to speak, when we speak about debt, in sovereign debt, we have to speak briefly about colonialism and the roots of the debt crisis in the Global South. And then I will come to a very important part of the meeting, the history of Argentina and Ecuador and their experience with sovereign debt defaults and what we can learn from their struggle for people's default. And finally, I will speak about what, and that's probably what interests a lot of you guys here, that what are the lessons that we can draw from these struggles for the current situation in Europe. So before I actually start off, I wanted to say something more general about also debt in pre-capitalist societies, and that it's, of course, as many of you might know, it's a concept that predates, that has a very long history, and there are many interesting anthropological studies of also of pre-capitalist receptions of debt. And if you just look at the terminology that we are still using, for example, in German, I'm from Germany, so the German word for money is Geld. So, which is, if you relate it to indemnity sacrifice, which is Old English Geld, I don't know how to pronounce it, to be honest. Then you have the Gothic word for tax is Geld, and the modern English word Geld, obviously. So you can see what you see in there is basically this idea that someone who owes money is somehow guilty, has done something wrong. And you can see also in religions that they speak of forgive us our debt, they say in Lord's Prayer, so it's something you have done wrong. And that is a way of justifying a lot of extreme inequalities by saying you have done something wrong. And there's an interesting book on that. I don't agree on all of it, but it's interesting, by David Graeber. And he asks a really important question: who really owes what to whom? That's a question that we should ask ourselves throughout this meeting also. Who really owes what to whom? But to start off now, what is sovereign debt? The picture on the left side shows the Bank of England, and how the Bank of England was set up. The Bank of England is a good example because, as many of you might think when you hear sovereign debt, why do states have debt in the first place? Can't they just print money? States aren't they in charge of printing money? And historically, that has always been the case that feudal rulers decide, oh, I want to do this, I want to build a palace, so I order them to print a lot of money. But what you get then is obviously you get inflation. And you still have now, as modern states developed, you got a distinction between the central bank and the government, and in theory these two should be independent, and the central bank has the task of controlling the amount of money in circulation by setting the interest rate and setting rules on how much money the commercial banks should have, whereas the government should not really mingle with what the central bank is doing. That's a theory. In practice, of course, you can still see governments telling central bank to just print money. Like Robert Mugabe, for example, tried that and you get an inflation of 100,000%. Other central banks, such as the Fed in America, they can do that and they can get away with it. They just print lots of money. That's basically indicates a different power relation, and we will come back to that later. Now, briefly on the terminology, a lot of people confuse sovereign debt with public deficit. Public deficit is simply the difference between government income and taxes is basically government income and the spending per year, whereas sovereign debt is actually the long-term debt by a central government that can be internally or externally. It's like the government can owe money to its own citizens, or it can be abroad to international financial institutions such as the IMF. But what is interesting about sovereign debt is that the government guarantees the repayment, but ultimately, it's actually the repayment is subject to sovereign immunity. That makes a difference from, if you or me would borrow a lot of money and we can't pay it back, we get into a lot of trouble. But if a state does that, okay, they also get into trouble, but they have the sovereign right, theoretically, to refuse to repay their debt. And obviously, we're going to speak about that later. But for now, it's important to remember that the government borrows money by issuing bonds. And I will briefly explain a bit what bonds are. A bond is pretty much like an IOU. So the government borrows money from us. If we buy a bond, we borrow, we lend the government money. And so you can say, a government wants to introduce a reform, And for this reform, it needs a lot of money, which it doesn't have this year, but it expects that it's going to have that next year by raising some more taxes, and that's how it's going to make money in future. So what it does is it sells bonds to people and says, listen, I'm going to have taxes in future, and that's how I'm going to give you the money back. And a bond has a certain maturity, let's say 10 years. You can buy a bond with a 10-year maturity. That means that after 10 years, you know for sure you get your money back. And you buy this bond at a par value, which is the initial value at which you buy the bond. And why would you do that? Because you also get an interest rate from the government. Usually in a half-year period, you get what is called a coupon on your bond. So that just seems pretty straightforward. It gets a bit more complicated because the par value at which you buy the bond initially is not the actual price of the bond that you have later, because bonds can be traded on the bond market. That's what people do to make money. And then you see that the value of bonds can be extremely different depending on the strength of the country, like a certain country's economy and different factors. And what you also have is you have an inverse relationship between the interest rate in the country and the value of bonds. So that is also what influences the value of bonds. And rating agencies estimate the risk of bonds. So if there's a risk, if it's deemed to be a risky investment, for example, buy a Greek bond, then it can also be more profitable because Greece obviously has to pay more interest rates. I think it should be in it. You can see how this developed basically throughout the crisis. So already I'm going to fast forward a bit and show you something about Europe, which is really interesting, I think, because this is the borrowing costs for the different governments. Basically, on 10-year bond, like bonds with a 10-year maturity. You see, like this is January, that starts basically, the crisis starts, and you see how it is diverging, and Italy and Spain, for them it's relatively expensive, even though actually their debt crisis is mainly in private banks. Whereas France and Germany, for them it gets cheaper. But to go back, briefly, about the current crisis, what we're at the moment in is what Keynesians would call a liquidity trap. The problem is that usually when you have an economic crisis, what the central bank would do in order to stimulate the economy is to keep the interest rates really low so that more money is in circulation. Because if the interest rates are low, people have less incentive to save money and are more likely to spend it. That's the idea behind it. But actually what we've seen throughout the last decades is a structural tendency that profitability has become lower and lower. It has become more and more difficult. So interest rates have been structurally already quite low. So there wasn't really much point in keeping them even more low because they were already close to zero. So what they basically did is the central bank bought bonds from commercial banks, and that's how they tried to inject money in the economy, because they did not directly subsidize a certain government or so, but they bought over, like commercial banks were owning government bonds that might have been risky, and the central bank printed, what it essentially did is it bought them by just making up new money. The central bank is the only one who can actually do that, and that sounds crazy for most of us here, but they just increased the money amount that they have in their accounts and use that to buy up a lot of bonds. And this is how they responded to the current crisis, and this process is called quantitative easing. So now, let's go briefly over. I talked a lot about like really abstract, complicated stuff. How would Marxists look at this process? So as I indicated already before a bit, bonds are a promise of future value. So that appears as a commodity. It's basically, it seems to turn everything a bit around, because we actually know that the value is in commodities. But if you buy a bond, you think that you're actually buying a commodity, and you feel that it's actually creating value in itself because you regularly get your interest payment, your coupon. So it's the other way around, basically, as it actually is. And bonds are what Marx would call fictitious capital, because they cannot be simultaneously converted into use value. That sounds really complicated, but what we mean by that is that it sounds, the movement of bonds and the bond market that I mentioned earlier sounds completely detached from the real economy, but actually it is all based on the speculation of a future value. At the moment, when the government sells its bonds, basically makes debt, it doesn't have anything to repay that, but it creates the illusion that it has. And if everyone loses confidence and tries to get their money back, that's simply impossible, because there is not an equivalent exchange of use value for all the amount of debt that has been made. So if we look at the Marxist perspective of this dynamic, then as Marxists we would say that the value, the actual value, lies in commodities and that have been produced through human labor and not in bonds. So that is what I indicated before, that the picture seems to be the other way around, and that's a potentially explosive situation, as you can imagine. Now, you would say maybe this is fundamentally wrong, and why do they actually do that? Simply because debt is a fundamental component of capitalist system and of the capitalist production. It's a very dynamic system by which you constantly have to produce and sell things and have a constant circulation of money, basically, in order to create more money. That's like how you have to compete against each other. And what debt basically does to that circulation, because you can have problems, the capitalist has only a limited amount of money for which he can produce, and he can have problems because he has not enough money to invest. So he borrows money, which he expects to be able to repay later. At the same time, consumers do the same. They want to buy something, but they don't have the money yet, so they borrow money. This seems to give the system an enormous elasticity. You think that it can go on endlessly, and there's no conflict anymore. But at the same time, it increases the contradictions in capitalist production, because it blows up, and what you get is like massive bubbles, as we've seen in the Korean crisis. So actually, what that does, it makes economies more vulnerable to crisis. So now I've talked a lot about the economic, pretty much dry abstract picture, and I'll try to fit it into the general story so that it makes a bit more sense. But if we look now at the history of sovereign debt defaults, then obviously, and of debt in general, then we can't avoid, we have to speak about the history of colonialism, in which debt is pretty much rooted. So this picture shows a slave uprising in Saint Dominique in Haiti around 1790, and I think it's a very good example, because Haiti was the first country where slaves actually gained independence after a massive slave uprising. Very inspiring story, by the way. But what happened then is what was at that time very common was the so-called gunboat diplomacy. That the former colonial powers, in that case France, literally surrounded Haiti with their navy and threatened to attack if they wouldn't pay back a compensation, which at that time was, let me look it up, I think it was an equivalent to a modern $21 billion. So that completely crippled the Haitian economy. So they were now formally independent, they had no more slavery, but they were indebted. And that's basically a pattern that you see throughout the global south, and basically pretty much the root of existing inequalities. So in 1960, when a lot of countries just got independent, there was a total sum of 59 billion external debt imposed on the global south, and that was at that time the value. And now it would have been now a lot more. So this is the root of the debt crisis in the global south. I'm going to speak a bit more about it now. Probably a lot of people already have heard a bit of the stories, but I'm just going to try to give you an impression. What happened in the context of the 1960s was that a lot of often leftist or progressive governments came to power in many newly independent countries, and there was a general idea that basically you need a strong state to intervene in the economy. And the current dominant model in the global south at the time was import substitution industrialization. So basically the government intervening in the national economy to stimulate independent production, that it doesn't have to export a lot of stuff from countries like America, so from basically the rich former colonial powers also. So what happened then is that obviously that did cost a lot of money, and their economies were really crippled by the consequences of colonialism. At the same time, you saw in the early 1970s that it was very, very cheap to borrow money, because there were a lot of what they call petrodollars in circulation, basically from the rising oil prices after 1973. And a lot of countries basically fell into the trap of borrowing a lot of money simply because it was so cheap. But then what you got in the late 1970s, when another economic crisis kicked in, was that borrowing suddenly became expensive, and interest rates for the loans that they already made rose exponentially. simultaneously with that process, you got the United States government, and you got in America, in England you got Thatcher, in America Ronald Reagan, who basically contributed to this emergence of the new idea of neoliberalism and the Washington Consensus. And at that time you see also that a lot of democratically elected governments were simply overthrown. And this is how actually the debt crisis really aggravated. You can see that, for example, in Argentina, in a brief period of time, that while the wages were reduced by 50%, the debt actually rose. So, at that time, also institutions such as the IMF and the World Bank first time that they actually rose to prominence and intervened in these economies. And that was basically the recipe that they prescribed. They said, you have debt, it's your fault. You didn't manage your household well, so that's why we have to implement austerity measures. That was a very successful way of changing this discourse from we have committed a terrible crime with colonialism into it's your fault, it's your debt. That brings us back to the question that I started in the beginning, who actually owns what to whom. And that is actually also important to remember if we look back later on the current situation. This is a good example of the human cost that is actually connected to the debt repayments, which really crippled many countries. You can see in that time, this is even from the 1990s, that countries such as Cameroon they had only 4% of their gross domestic product that they could spend on social services, whereas 36% went to servicing of the debt. And you can see that as a pattern in many countries. And that obviously meant that millions of people would die simply because they didn't have access to medical care and things like that. And of course, the World Bank and the IMF knew that this was going to happen, but they have chosen to prefer the interest of the creditors over the interest of the people. So when we speak about sovereign debt defaults now, it's a nice picture, right? It took me ages to type it. When we speak about sovereign debt defaults now, it always seems as if they are something completely extraordinary, and it's the end of the world. It's like a nuclear bomb drops on you and there's no future after it. And that's not true, because there have been, just as economic crises are an inherent feature of capitalism, sovereign debt defaults are as well. And you see, all of these countries, this is just actually the official defaults. If you look at different form of debt restructuring, you get a list that is, I would say, at least 3 times as long. And I hope this is, I guess it is more or less complete. I've taken it from an IMF source. But what is interesting, if you look at it, is that you notice that most of the countries are actually countries in the global south, which are, most of them are not really a big chunk of the modern economy. And if they default, like Trinidad and Tobago defaults, yes, that is terrible for the people there, but the consequences are not going to be felt as much as, for example, a default of Greece. And this is what we really should keep in mind. This is a very historic moment that we see. Of course, countries in the West have also defaulted before, but this is a very historic moment because that we see that actually the crisis is now in the core of the Eurozone. That shows the significance and the depth of the current crisis. So briefly talking about how do countries actually default. In theory, countries can't default. That's why a bond is such a good investment. In theory, because a country can always extract more tax value from its citizens and always take more money out of it. And that's pretty much what the creditors want, right? They want their money back and they don't care how many people die for that. So that already indicates the confrontation inherent in a sovereign debt default and the class struggle that is an essential part of it. You see that what I said before, that international financial institutions are willing to accept the starvation and death of millions of people. But this is a pretty grim picture, but we should distinguish here between a creditor and a debtor-led default. And what I've talked about so far is a creditor-led default. So the creditors have the driving initiative in just asking to get their money back. What I'm going to talk on now is different examples for debtor-led default, especially in Argentina and Ecuador. And I think they're really important examples that we can learn from. So I would use the term people's default also for debtor-led default, basically a default in the interest of people. I've mentioned Argentina already before. as in many other countries of the global south, the debt was essentially already rooted from the history of colonialism, and then what you had this military dictatorship from the mid-70s till the early 80s, which really, that was one of the factors that, where in that time I think the debt quadrupled, if I'm correct now, to look at my notes. At the same time, the peso was pegged against the dollar, which means they had supposedly the same value, and that also contributed to the problems, which is interesting if you look at the Eurozone, where they also have supposedly the same economic strength, and you see systematic problems developing. So far, sovereign debt defaults have been a pretty abstract story. By the way, how much time do we have?
Another 15 minutes.
Okay, excellent. So far, debts have been a pretty abstract story, something that's maybe hard to imagine. But if you would try to imagine what a sovereign debt default could feel like for you, look like for you, imagine you watch the news and you hear a report that you can only take out a limited amount of money from your bank account because they fear capital flight and everything. Obviously, what would happen is that you, in panic, you would run to the bank and try to get back your money. But as you would get there, the banks would be closed and they would tell you, sorry, we can't do that, we're not giving out money anymore. That's literally what happened in Argentina. Now try to imagine what a sovereign debt default would sound like. That sounds a bit funny, but what basically the response of people was is that they went out on streets with pots and pans and made a lot of noise and just like tried to claim their money back. Obviously not really successful, because the actual capital flight that the government was talking about, it had already taken place months ago, because the large capitalists had already taken their money into safe havens pretty much. So if we go back to the Marxist understanding of fictitious capital that I talked about earlier, the idea that basically you can't at the same time exchange all this fictitious capital into use value, into something concrete. That's what you literally see in Argentina when everyone tries to get their money back and it just doesn't work out because there isn't enough there. Obviously this is how the crisis started. Basically, it was then the case that Argentina defaulted again. They already defaulted a couple of times, but before that have been so-called orderly defaults or creditor-led defaults, and they have not actually succeeded in sustainably improving the situation. Now you get basically a massive street movement. You had general strikes and a lot of protests, and in this context, Nestor Kirchner came to power in 2003, and he started with a bit of a different approach, because he started to renationalize important industries and started to restructure the debt in a more innovative way, and actually it led to a 57% haircut. So basically that means that most of the debt that the government owed to creditors, they didn't pay it back. And that proved to be a really smart move, because as you can see now, Argentina has economic growth rates of around 8%, which is incredibly strong if you imagine like the current context of global economic crisis. A similar example is Ecuador, even more recently actually. They had a similar experience, pretty much the same story, that starting from colonialism on, and you had like right-wing dictatorships and everything. And also like the IMF intervening with so-called orderly defaults, which wasn't really successful. And around 2000, debt repayments took up 2/3 of the country's GDP. So the country was literally crippled. They couldn't do anything anymore. In this context, a lot of leaders have already, like the predecessor, like in 2007, Rafael Correa came to power because they literally kicked out his predecessor. And in 2005, mass movement just moved out. Basically, it was decided that the IMF staff had to leave, had to be expelled from Ecuador because there was such a massive level of resistance. Actually, I just talked to one of the cleaners from SOAS, and he told me also the story. He was involved in that movement and really enthusiastic. Unfortunately, he's cleaning now, so he can't come. But he's from Ecuador, and he's really proud. But basically, coming back to the actual story of sovereign debt defaults, what happened is that Rafael Correa has chosen a really interesting approach, because he organized a committee which basically investigated the debt in Ecuador and checked if it was actually legal, because there's under international law a concept that is called odious debt. And that means that if the debt is, for example, made by a dictator or in a way that doesn't interest the majority, isn't it benefit the majority of the people, then you can declare your debt odious and you don't have to repay it. And that's pretty much what Ecuador is planning to do. And they actually did it in a very smart way, because they didn't initially just say, oh, we're never ever going to pay anything back, but they started buying up their own like risky assets via the Banco del Pacifico on the bond market. And then by the time they had about 50% of these risky assets, of the overall assets, they started to announce their default. And at that time they were the principal, so they had pretty much the majority of the bonds, so that they had much more say in the repayments. And then they actually just they offered only a very tiny part of the actual value of the bonds to the creditors, so that they actually pretty much declared the debt odious. And because what is interesting about the Ecuadorian default is that, in contrast to many other defaults before, Ecuador decided not to just pay back the creditors, not because they couldn't do so. Maybe they could have squeezed people a bit more, I don't know, probably that would have been terrible, but they decided they're going to prioritize social spending over paying back creditors and dealing with the IMF. So this is a really important lesson, and I think also a really inspiring example that we can learn from. Finally, I will try to link these stories that I've told before on popular struggles around sovereign debt default to the European Union and the struggles that we see, especially now in Greece, like Greek workers still fighting back. And I think the first thing that we should see is, like, if we look at the current crisis in the Eurozone, the way they often want to frame it is as a debt crisis, as a sovereign debt crisis. And what is often said then, yeah, it's because of the Greeks, they're lazy and they just spend too much money in the past decades, and this is how it all happened. Interestingly, that's exactly what they said about many African countries before, and that's what they said about Latin America before. But I hope my talk made a bit clear that this is actually not really related to like a lot of sums and social spending, but on the way like that bonds work and that the bond market works, partly, and the way that they expect a country to be able to extract surplus value from its citizens. Because you can see that a country in Europe, which is at the moment relatively strong, is Germany, whereas the Mediterranean countries mainly are suffering more. And the reason for that is actually that Germany in the past decades has been really successful in extracting surplus value from workers by keeping the wages structurally low. We still don't have a minimum wage in Germany. So like when I work in a bar in Germany, like they pay me €4, €5 sometimes, which is like maybe £3 or so. It's ridiculous. I mean, that's a really extreme example, but this is how the German economy has been kept stable. Talking too much about it, but so you see that basically this is how Germany got its structural advantage, and that indicates that the bond market and borrowing costs are indeed related to the real economy and related to concrete exploitations of workers in the Eurozone. But there are also important differences, I think, with the history of debt crisis. And what I mentioned earlier, we're talking now about a crisis in the heart of the Western world. And that indicates actually how serious the current crisis is, that we're talking about default in the Eurozone. And that also explains, I think, why the IMF and the World Bank, in a way, have been almost more careful not to intervene as hardcore as they did in for example, Chile or other countries, where they just like removed democratic leaders. I mean, they've done that in Europe, but maybe they become more smart or so. I don't know. But they're also definitely willing to see it, as you can see, to do it, as you can see from the example in Italy and also partly in Greece. But what they basically did is they set up an alternative structure to the IMF, specifically for Europe. This alternative structure has previously been called European Financial Stability Facility, EFSF, and is now called ESM, which is pretty much a European version of the IMF. And I think that's really important for all of you to remember. If you hear ESM and it sounds like something that doesn't make sense to you, just imagine it's a European IMF. And that's basically, they're planning, and they're already doing pretty much the same to us as they did throughout the global south. And we've seen the consequences. We have seen that it definitely doesn't work. You can squeeze the workers even more, and at the same time the debt rises and rises. But the examples of Ecuador and Argentina have illustrated that we don't have to accept that. We can actually challenge it. It's not that a default is just a nuclear bomb and we just like all dead after that. No, we can actually influence it, and we can we can fight for a default that is in our interest. We can refuse to repay that, and I think that Greece should definitely refuse to repay its debt. That's a really important lesson that we can draw from this example, and even parts of the ruling class are admitting that probably it might be in the interest economically for Greece to default and find a new way of debt restructuring. But at the same time, I also want to make a critical remark, because the problem which you always get with these talks about debt is that they are somehow detached from what I would say the real economy and the production. And where the actual, I think that is where the actual inequalities and the problem lies, and the structural difficulties. And so it is insufficient to just say, I'm going to default, and after that we have a perfect socialist utopia. No, of course you have to link it to concrete struggles, because you see, for example, with the default in Iceland, and also in other countries, that the first thing that happens when you default is probably that your currency, your national currency, loses a lot of value, which means that workers have to accept, after all these austerity measures, even more wage cuts. So you have to link it to struggles to fight for social justice and a much broader economic program of redistribution and making the rich pay for the crisis. So these are actually the three lessons that I would like to draw from this. First, we can see the scale of the crisis, which is unprecedented, and it's in the heart of the Western world. Second, that we can fight against the creditor debt default, and we have the ability to change it and to influence it in our interest. And the third one is that we cannot just expect to default and afterwards it's all going to be good. No, we have to link it to a much broader struggle against capitalism, and the actual problem lies in the capitalist system, and that's what we have to fight against.
Greece right now. In the Greek anti-capitalist left, we have been calling for unilateral, people-led default for quite some long time, since the crisis began 2008-2009, when this demand was only a part of a very small percentage of the radical movement. But then we managed to spread it out, influence bigger parts, both of the academia. There are now some radical lecturers and professors doing studies on this and commenting actually on how the whole structure, the whole neoliberal structure of the European Union and the project is actually accumulating debt for Greece, on top of all the accumulation of military expenditures of the previous years, spending on bailouts again and again for private interests of the Greek industrialists and the Greek ship owners in the past, and how all this connect to here and now demand of direct cancellation of the debt and not recognition. During the past, there have been three approaches, and up to now you can see in the popular discussions about how do we approach the issue of the debt for countries. The one it says is the absolute neoliberal one. Treat countries as they were individuals. If they're not paying, send the gunboats there, and if the gunboats are not enough or they are too big and scary, you can send in your the technocrats, as they call them, which means the hired bankers, the lackeys of the IMF, the European Union, the European Central Bank, sent by Goldman Sachs to rule countries like Greece and Italy. And this is actually when they see a country dead the sea is, as the vultures would see a carcass. They see opportunity there, they see privatization there, they see the misery of people is gleaming gold in their eyes. On the other hand, there is, and there are some UN resolutions and some popular understandings that, when sometimes it's too obvious that it is a dictator debt, it is odious, or it has been accumulated despite without people knowing, it should be cancelled, and there should be specific regulations for doing that. This is a welcome thing, but for my own, it's not even enough, because it's not even challenging the very nature of what debt is about. And the third is and it has been mentioned here, and the first, one of the most successful people's default was in Russia, with the Russian Revolution in 1917, and in 1920s the people's state of Russia went out and says this is not only our debt. It wasn't accumulated in our own interest. It wasn't accumulated even in our own name. It was accumulated by another class, by the Tsar, by their expensive, luxurious dealings with and their diplomacy, and this has nothing to do with us. We totally denounce this debt, we're not going to pay it, and we're going to enforce that. And we want to drain on this radical tradition of how people they default, the most extreme and successful example, to here and now in Greece, Spain, Italy, Iceland, or wherever this problem arises in the global south as well. There is the way we can enforce a default by taking direct control of the means, and especially the financial means. In 2006, it can be happened because in 2006-2007 we had a strike, where there was a strike within the National Bank of Greece and the Bank of Greece, where for 2 or 3 days the workers decided that we will not stop paying any interest payments, any transaction between banks both within and outside Greece, but we will only allow pensions and wages and salaries to be paid through the banks. That's real workers' control. It can be happen today, and popular default should go through the people. Otherwise, it will be the root of the same problem again. We have to see that now.
I'm from the Netherlands, and I just had a question actually, because you talked about the consequences for a country of not paying back. That it should not be struggle should not be only about that, but also about further social justice. But what are the consequences for a country when it refuses to pay debts back? For example, for Argentina, or what if Greece would do that? Could you explain more about that?
Very recently, I have been making some very disturbing observations, and I believe now that with the problems we are having in the West, is that the monetary system in the West is going to totally collapse. The reason this is very disturbing, because I understand that China has been buying up Western bonds right, left and centre. So when the collapse does come, China is going to bail us out, and this will mean that we will come under the total control of Beijing, and I'm not looking forward to that. So indeed, I think we could be in very serious trouble. Thank you.
Thanks for your very clear introduction. I have 2 questions. I read, and maybe we can talk more about this, that the ruling class in Europe actually realizes that austerity in a problematic way deepens the crisis, so that they use central banks actually to support the banks. So how does what's the Marxist view on that? And in what way could this create inflation in Europe? Because there is this classic example of, I think it was in Germany, 1923, where there, you had to have truckloads of money to buy a piece of bread. So, do we have to be prepared for that scenario as well?
First of all, let me say that I think things are bad enough without worrying about a Chinese takeover of the European Union. I don't think that's the main concern at the moment. In terms of the solutions to the debt crisis in Europe, the fundamental solution will be to restore massive growth to Europe, to restore the rate of profit in the European economies and to ensure growth. The problem is there's absolutely no sign of that. And because there's absolutely no sign of that, the crisis is going to continue, and we're going to continue to see desperate measures to try and solve a crisis which don't actually deal with the underlying problem. What I want to talk about is the situation in Greece and what we should say about it. The first and most obvious thing we should say is, of course, Greece should default. Why should Greece default? First and foremost, because they've paid off the debt already many, many times over. Anyone who's been in a sort of spiral of personal debt will be familiar with this problem. You get deeper and deeper into debt, you end up paying back many times. Secondly, it's absolutely fundamentally immoral that a country suffering a 1930s-style depression pays more in interest rates than it does in healthcare, education, housing for its population. There is simply no moral equivocation on this. Greece should stop paying it back. Thirdly, the debt crisis is going to get worse. Because there's no growth in Greece, the burden of debt gets bigger and bigger and bigger. It's not diminishing over time, it's simply going to get worse. The sooner it defaults, the better. In terms of the kind of default, I think Mona's absolutely right. We have to talk about a debtor-led default, not a default in which the institutions of Europe come in and squeeze the last drop of blood out of the Greek people. We want a debtor-led default controlled from Greece, not controlled from the Troika and IMF and the European Stability Mechanism. The final thing, though, I think it's very important to say, it's not enough to talk about a people's default or a national solution. We have to understand there are class differences in Greece as well. We don't want to default and then let off the hook the people at the top of Greek society, the bankers, the politicians, the captains of industry in Greece, who've conspired to create this situation. It's simply not true that there is a single interest for all Greek people. There are two divergent interests in Greece. And that's why it's absolutely true that we should say, yes, default, yes, leaving the euro, which is a trap for the Greek economy, but also nationalisation, also control of the banks, also stopping rich Greeks taking their money out of the country, as they're beginning to do already, and also we have to talk about elements of workers' control. We have to talk about mass struggle from below, and a programme in the interest of the mass of Greek workers, not a programme in the interest of the Greek people, but a programme in the interest of the Greek working class.
Had I known this was being filmed, I would have worn something different. Anyway, whenever I try to compare sort of the teachings of Marx and Marxism to bond rates, I take it generally from the average wage rate and then add all the complexities of the various bond markets to it, because, as was said by the speaker, they are both treated as commodities, and it comes to the capitalists to try and maximise their returns from that commodity. So as the wage rate is reduced to its minimum to maximise the exploitation and profits, when it comes to bonds and the returns from investments, then they obviously try to leverage the difference between the interest rates and the expected return from any activity. So when any system deals with resources and when to lend it to other people, if they are done on this on exploitation or reward interest basis, then the crisis, in my perspective, is always incoming, always inevitable, because there will always be this drive to compare it to this basic interest rate and maximising expectations. And so there will always be this method of forcing all kinds of horrible conditions onto the repayee, as it were, rather than, rather just say onto the debtor rather than the creditor, that because of the power relations involved in the debt relation, that it's always going to fall on the debtor. So just sort of as a future point to perhaps move past bonds and beyond the capitalist financial system, we have to sort of move past the idea that we can expect profit-driven returns, that anyone can sign a contract and demand such an excess return. There has to be the expectation that the giving of these resources to any institution, the benefits from it must be from the giving rather than the receiving back. And I think that's an important point when discussing any sort of alternatives, things like that, that if we set basic returns and, of course, competitive returns, that if people can look at various investment options and will always have to maximise their returns, then this is always going to occur. So when developing alternative structures, alternative investments, things like that, it becomes very important to focus on the cooperative nature of it, onto the ways of mutual benefit rather than simple individual returns. So, thank you.
Two things. First, I wanted to pick up on the comments about China, because I think whenever there's an economic crisis, you always get this tension about whether people look to class or look to nation as a solution. I think in Greece you've seen this, where people, complaining back to kind of German takeover, whatever. It's not something new either. If you think back to the 1970s in this country, people were told it was the gnomes of Zurich that were responsible for the economic problems. And I think, whichever country the gnomes come from, or bankers, or whatever you want to call them from, we're against them all, aren't we? Whether it's in the city of London or whether it's in Beijing. But the second thing I wanted to ask for a bit of clarification on, I wasn't entirely convinced by your explanation of why the Greek economy was weaker than the German one, because I think, obviously there are some low-paid workers in Germany, but I think the typical wages in Greece are even lower than that. And I don't think our explanation for why the Greek economy is, clearly the mainstream explanation, which is that the Greeks are lazy and so on, would reject. But I think the idea that German workers are paid worse, I don't think holds water. I think the real explanation is perhaps to do with the level of investment there's been by the capitalists in Germany compared to Greece. So just the same as if you're working, agricultural labourer and you're working in sub-Saharan Africa, you're probably using a little bit less equipment than somebody in East Anglia, and yet you're competing in the same market. So, in Marxist language, they talk about socially necessary labour time. So that, the Greeks are spending loads and loads of time working, but actually aren't being as productive as a German worker doing the same amount of work, because they're having to work with much worse, older and less advanced equipment. So I think importantly, it's again down to the kind of failures of the capitalists rather than the failures of the workers as to why the economy is so weak in Greece. And I think it's really important that we kind of undercut that moral line they're trying to make about debt being our fault somehow if we're in debt. It's actually it's a product of the system, it's a product of the people at the top that people are up in debt, not some failure of the workers who are having to do a much harder job than they should be able to because the capitalists simply haven't invested.
Joseph Chinara made a very good point about the necessity of there having to be more growth for the capitalist system to escape the current impasse that it's in, which is right, because capitalism only works when it's expanding. The problem with it is, of course, is that continued growth is not possible if you look at the environment and the planet that we live on and the state that it's in today. If you look at the amount of carbon we can produce and all that, and most climatologists would agree that's simply not possible. So that's a big problem for capitalism. And I think it's a case of trying to for the people trying to devise another way of getting out of that. Capitalism's already large enough. It doesn't need to get any bigger. We already produce enough food and stuff for everyone to meet everyone's needs. What continued growth means is even more overproduction on a massive scale, and that's just not simply sustainable. So I think we do need a better discussion on the lower levels of society. We need the presentation you gave is exactly the type of thing we need. We need people, working class people, to be talking about it and to try to understand stuff like the bond markets. So on that note, I would encourage anyone, like other people have said, who've got any even basic questions about it, and I'd like to hear the answers about what any of this means, any simple terminology. Yeah, I'll leave it there. Thanks.
I just wanted to say something about Iceland, which doesn't seem to have been mentioned at all. I mean, it's extremely interesting, is Iceland. I think it did take an IMF loan. I don't actually know that much about it. I've just been there once. And I know that they were all the Icelanders, 300,000 of them. It's a very small, very isolated country. And what seems to have happened is that there was a lot of protest, and they did the pots and pans thing as well outside the parliament. But you haven't mentioned it, and I just think it's really important. And they did, I think they got an IMF loan. I'm right, aren't I? Did they? And they've almost paid it back, and their economy is growing. Not sure that that's brilliant, but it is growing. And also, which has got very, very little publicity, I think an ex-Prime Minister has been found guilty of some kind of corruption, but he wasn't imprisoned, unfortunately. And also, there have been at least 2 banksters who have been found guilty and imprisoned, only for 4.5 years, but it's better than nothing. It's a damn sight better than we're doing here. So I just wanted to know if you'd just make some comment about Iceland, which is a really, really interesting case.
One of the things I noticed about the elections, the Greek elections, and one of the reasons I think that the right won the election, they sold the idea of fear. Fear was the thing that they were selling their program on. If you go back to the Greek currency, is going to be chaos, but there's chaos already in the country, right? And it's trying to sort of inspire confidence in the idea that there is an alternative, and that there's an alternative to the chaos, right? Which I think really boils down to building the confidence of the working class, that organized element. The petty bourgeois will suffer from fear, irrespective of what's going on. Because at the end of the day, they're operating as individuals, right? They're seeing what's going on and they have no control over it. At least working class people have control some degree or have a potential for some degree of control in terms of their own workplaces. This can inspire people to believe that they can actually have a default on their own terms, right? And I would like to say here that crucial to here, I would think would be the banking system. I think that an argument has to be made that we're going to have exchange controls. We're going to close the borders. We're not going to let the rich run off with their money to London to increase the price of housing in London, right? I think the real crucial bit here is the working class is the key element in having a successful default, and that means really that's where our Greek comments will hopefully be concentrating on.
I just wanted to say a little bit about the elegant symmetry between inequality and wealth. Some work done on the collateralized debt obligations, the packaging of subprime mortgages, suggests that whilst most of the focus has been on the production of these by banks and mortgage originators, there's an issue about who was buying these products ultimately. And a lot of work's been done to suggest that high net worth individuals, HNWIs, historically have bought a huge amount of these things. The reason being that institutions and banks and rich individuals have been buying bonds over the last decade, putting downward pressure on yields, making it more attractive for new securities to be produced, which would generate more yield. So basically, what's been happening is poor people's mortgages being packaged to provide yield for rich individuals looking for safe havens. They weren't actually very safe in finality, but who are looking for new vehicles to place their wealth. Now, this is actually colossal. So essentially what we've got is a huge growth in inequality over the last decade, poor people being forced into debt, that debt being securitized and being bought by the wealthy looking for places to store their wealth. As I say, it's fascinating how inequality produces its own symmetry.
I'm a member of the IS in Denmark, and I have one comment and one question. We had our Greek comrade 2 weeks ago in Copenhagen to speak about the experience about the election in Greece, and he was talking about the fear that the ruling class in Greece was trying to impose on the population. He said that the days up to the election, the pharmacies was closed for medicine, that it was impossible for people with diabetes and cancer to buy medicine. And it was a way of the ruling class in Greece telling people, don't vote for the left wing, because if you're voting for the left wing, it will become chaos. You will not get the medicine. You will the country will collapse. And he said that was a way of imposing fears into the Greek people. And my question is maybe in the same way, saying, can Greece make a default, a people's default alone? Because you were talking about this gunship diplomacy. You were talking. If Greece are alone, what about a boycott from the rest of the EU? What about the reaction from the rest of the ruling class in the rest of the world? Can they do it alone? And I would like you to comment on that.
A couple of comments. I think there's something to be said about a kind of colonial relationship between Germany and Greece at the moment, and actually I hadn't really thought through the whole history of sovereign debt and that kind of list of places that had defaulted and all being places that had experienced that colonial relationship, and then now Greece and Germany. It's the first time I kind of thought of it like that. The second thing I wanted to say, and maybe you've got some comments on that colonial stuff, was about, again with the Greek election, that kind of fear placed on people wasn't just about default, it was about getting kicked out of the Eurozone, and people kind of haven't mentioned that. And I suppose my perspective on that is that it's that same thing that the guy in the purple shirt said about, well, even if you got kicked out of the Eurozone, you go back to the drachma, the same class dynamic remains. You know, you still have a Greek capitalist class, whether they're imposing their will on you with a Eurozone currency or with the drachma, like that relationship is going to remain. So you've got to look beyond just the point of that default, getting kicked out of the euro or walking out of the euro, whichever way that goes around, and what happens next. So, you know, kind of building for that struggle is going to be a longer term thing, I think, than just what happens in the next few months as well. So kind of building those organisations to challenge that capitalist structure, whether it's, you know, under the drachma or whether it's under the euro, is a long-term program, and the fight will continue. One of the other things I heard about the election was that actual bosses in big workplaces in Greece were saying to the workers, if you don't vote for New Democracy, you won't have a job on Monday, and we will track you down and we will know who's voted for Syriza and who's voted for New Democracy. And if we find out you vote for Syriza, we're going to sack you, basically. So that level of fear, even the working class people that did vote for New Democracy, I think, did it very much in a resentful way and did say, you know, I voted for the thieves. I didn't really want to, but I feel like I have no choice. So there was definitely not anything positive about the way that the election result coming out for New Democracy was any kind of affirmation of the working class. It was just, I think, pure fear, which is something I'm feeling slightly now, standing in front of all of you, but through that.
3 points. One is the debt rating agencies. Now, it wasn't that long ago that they were categorising various bonds, etc., as, you know, AAA and all the rest of it. Now, 2 years later, they've become junk. But the reputation of the rating agencies remains the same. They don't seem subject to criticism. And they also seem to have a particular view of how it will pan out. And there must be alternative ways of thinking about how economies can survive. That's point one. Second is, when you're talking about what people talk about, what they don't talk about. So how about the hundreds of billions which are in tax havens and, you know, escaping interest and tax? Virtually all the vast majority of the FTSE 100 companies are utilising tax havens. The majority of large British companies are using tax havens. Silence on it. You know, and you always have to think about silence. What does that mean? And the third thing I just wanted to talk about, mention something. Someone's talking about the concept of growth. And I think there's actually a very good article by Gareth Dale in his National Social Journal on growth. Depends what you mean by growth. If we wanted to switch from building loads of cars and starting to move into public transport and coaches and railways, in one sense, it's less growth. In another way, it's a much more sensible use of our resources. And so when we talk about not having growth and the implications for the environment, we should talk about what sort of growth we're talking about, in what sort of way. Thank you.
A lot of things have been raised, and I'm sorry if sometimes I had to be a bit simplistic or a bit brief, simply because it's a very big drama playing in front of us, and you have to take all the elements in it and try to summarize it in 40 minutes. I want to briefly spend a bit more time on the structural inequalities in the Eurozone, because I think it's important. I mean, on the one hand, it is really striking, and I completely agree, it is really striking the similarities with colonialism. And also like the structural inequalities, like what you see, for example, between America and Argentina, and similar patterns developing between, for example, Greece and Germany. Obviously, it is a bit simplistic to say it's just because of the wages. That's one factor. There are a lot of other factors that are related to it. For example, German exports have been strengthened. Actually, I wanted to include a graph on that as well, but simply there wasn't much more time. But Germany's industry has been doing not so well actually in the 1990s when you had the reunification. It was quite complicated, but they really managed to recover. From the early 1990s was basically a turning point, because from that point on they decided to have a European monetary union. From that point on they had convergency criteria, which had set a certain limits, and it's really interesting to look at these criteria. And they limited basically the level of debt that a country is allowed to have. started introducing a lot of restrictions and sanctions, basically only aggravating the problem. And this economic convergence is actually a very important factor in explaining why there are now structural inequalities between countries. What this really importantly indicates is what Joseph in the purple shirt also mentioned, and that is the problem of our understanding of colonialism often also, that we see it as a conflict between countries. It's the North against the South. And that's also kind of the tendency that we talk about in the Eurozone. We see it as the core versus the periphery, and Germans benefiting from Greeks. Obviously that's not the case, and that's what I try to highlight with my example of German wages, is that it is not, obviously it's not German workers' fault. Obviously, then it would be my fault. Why would it be? Like, I have nothing to do with it. It's obviously the fact that it's a conflict between capital and labor that is the actual root of the problem. And that is why it's so important to not just limit or talk on sovereign debt to what is happening on the bond market, but actually see its relation to the real economy, and see that if we want to fight sovereign debt, we have to start what Kostas in the front also indicated from the examples of occupations and taking control of banks in Greece, that you have to start basically in the production and in the real economy, and not just in the bond market, and not just declaring debt odious, which is also a really, really good step in the first place. Then another example has been given, a really important point I think, is that can Greece organize the people's default alone? Obviously no. That is really important. I think we have not supposed to see around with saying solidarity also in Greek and in Arabic. I think that's the key word. There's going to be a massive attack, and the scale of the crisis, as I said before, is unprecedented. That means Greece is not going to be another Argentina. It's not going to have, in 2 years, it's going to have a growth rate of 8%. That's just not going to happen. So there's going to be a conflict of them against us, and we better arm us for that, and we better prepare us for that, and organize a fight back. So there are ways out of the crisis, but that actually involves, as you said, talking about the things that they don't talk about. Talk about the rich, talk about how we can get the money from them, and talk about how we can organize a fight back in that way. Obviously, there are some promising signs in Greece, and let me conclude on that, of basically that the radical left has become really strong. But they have, there's also a tendency of saying, okay, we have a right to do so, and we can find a harmonic way in the European Union of just declaring a debt odious and lobbying in the interest of the people, what sometimes you can understand from sections of the left. But this is not, it's not going to be a harmonic way, it's going to be a confrontation, it's going to be a clash. And the only way we can prepare ourselves for that is by building a massive movement from below that actually challenges a creditor-led default and fights for default in the interest of the people.